by the 1850s, railroad lines were rapidly spreading across some of the states. James and Ellen had found out that they could take a train to Michigan. And on their second train ride to Michigan is where I pick up this story. What was the interest in Michigan? Joseph Bates had been spreading the Sabbath all over Michigan. And there was a congregation in Jackson, Michigan, Battle Creek, Michigan, and there's stories with all those. And so when James and Ellen made it to Jackson and visited with the people there, they both felt the Lord was calling them onward to Wisconsin. There was a new train line going into Wisconsin, and they felt that the Lord was saying, take it. So while they were at home before heading out, they were preparing to take the train. They were both feeling very solemn, and they didn't know why. And so they had a season of prayer together, and they recommitted their lives to Christ. And Ellen wrote, we could not refrain from weeping, just feeling the presence of God. She goes, we went to the train depot with feelings of deep solemnity. On boarding the train, we went into a forward car which had seats with high backs, the ones where you could actually rest your head and maybe sleep. They were hoping to get a seat they could sleep in. But the car was full. So we passed back to the next car and found seats not nearly as nice. And she says, I did not, as usual when traveling, take my bonnet off. She goes, and I held my carpet bag in my hand as if I was waiting for something. And she goes, James and I both spoke of our singular feelings. We didn't understand them. About 3 miles out of Jackson, the train began to jerk violently back and forth, and then it finally came to a stop. And she looked out the window and saw there was one car raised up upon end, and she heard agonizing groans and cries of people and this confusion. And she saw that the engine had been thrown from the track, but the car they were on was on the track and separated by about 100 feet from all the rest of the train. The coupling had not been broken. She said our car had been unfastened from the one before it, as if an angel had separated them. She says the car in which we had tried to get a seat was all broken up, and one end was a big pile, a heap of ruins. There were people killed and some mortally wounded that wouldn't make it through the day, and many, many injured people. She says we could but feel that God had sent an angel to preserve our lives. I first heard that story at camp meeting when I was in kindergarten. I've never forgotten it. How many of you heard that story before? All right, maybe about half of you. If you'll take a look at the timeline that's in your bulletin, you'll see on 1848, it actually looks like a yellow hot air balloon, doesn't it? I thought of that after I'd done this work. But that date is a very important date in our church history because that's about when 50 people came into unity on the basic distinctive beliefs that we hold dear to this day. This is when Seventh-day Adventist theology was developed or came together. Now, it's mostly shared at this time by preaching and small Bible study group meetings. And at this time, only 2 people among the 50 had actually published any explanations in print. And one of them was Hiram Edson's and his friend's article explaining what happened in 1844 with the sanctuary in heaven. And the other one was Joseph Bates had published a book on the Sabbath called The Seventh-day Sabbath, A Perpetual Sign. Do you remember that Ellen had a vision to publish a paper at one of those Sabbath conferences in 1848? So the next year, 1849, the Whites were staying at the Belden home in Rocky Hill, Connecticut, and James felt like God was saying, start that paper now, get that journal going. And he wrote just 8 pages and had it typed up, although those 8 pages, if you ever see the copy of the original, it's very small print, so there's a lot on those 8 pages. But he entitled it Present Truth. So we're going to look at James White's publishing ventures. So Present Truth, even though he's in Rocky Hill, the publishing and mailing went out from Middletown, Connecticut, which you can see on your map in your bulletin. If you find Rocky Hill, Connecticut, Middletown's right close by. And so from this point on, James and publishing would go together like a hand and a glove. Not bad for a guy who only had 1 year of formal schooling. He didn't get to go to school until he was 15, and he had to start in first grade. But he did all 8 years in 1 year. I could talk about that for a while, but I won't. In the early year, James would write as he traveled and published and mailed out from wherever he lived at the time. The first 4 issues went from Middletown, Connecticut, and then the next 6 went out of Oswego, New York. Oswego's on the map, and you'll see it next to Lake Ontario. During this time, Ellen White's second son was born. Do you remember her first son's name? Henry Nichols White, named after the fellow who prayed for her healing and had a miraculous result. Well, her second son's name is James Edson. Those are kind of obvious, right? James after his father, and Edson after Hiram Edson, who Ellen White must have highly esteemed. So then the next step in these publishing adventures was from Auburn, New York, and he changed the name to the Advent Review. Well, why did he do that? Think about it. The advent of Christ had been the great hope of the Millerites, right? And these are the people James is trying to reach. They would see in this title a review of the Millerite message. And he felt that more people would be drawn to read with that title. So while living in the Auburn area, baby James Edson became ill. Anytime a child became ill in that time of history, it was cause for grave concern because children dying was very common. The average lifespan was not even 40 years. Now, it's not because people didn't normally live to be 80, but because so many children didn't reach adulthood that brought the average down. Many large families only saw 3 out of 10 children survive to adulthood. That was normal. And little James is all of a sudden really sick. They had a season of prayer and he revived. And then big James, Dad, he had an attack of cholera, and Ellen prayed and he was immediately well. So why such attacks from Satan and such quick positive answers to prayer for healing? Do you think that getting the truth published and mailed out of Auburn, New York was the reason? Now, it wasn't 8 pages anymore. It was up to 48. It was a pretty full message of truth that was going out in the Advent Review. Well, the next night, little James Edson, woke up screaming. And big James, Dad, rebuked the devil in the name of Jesus, and little James immediately fell peacefully back to sleep. And later that night, big James had an attack. This time it took 2 hours of prayer before there was relief. And then he was okay. The devil really wanted to stop that mailing. It's a war. So then they ended up in Paris, Maine, and in Paris, Maine, he came up with a new name. Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. So let's think about this for a minute. James remembered that Joshua Himes had named a Millerite journal the Advent Herald, meaning the proclamation of the Advent or soon return of Christ. So James saw the Advent now as under review for the reasons Jesus didn't come, and that the Sabbath was to be heralded and proclaimed as, well, along with the sanctuary as part of the explanation. And so this title he liked, and he stuck with this title for decades. And Saratoga Springs, which is also there on the PowerPoint, they settled down and lived there for a while and put out many issues from Saratoga Springs, New York. So you can see these on your map. And, and I just want to say that This verse just came to my mind when I was thinking about James' conviction of getting the truth out, because he believed this Bible promise. So shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please, and it shall prosper in the thing for which I sent it. So just looking where these places are, we have down in Connecticut, Rocky Hill, Middletown, where the first publication, the origin of what we call the Review Today, started coming out of Middletown, Connecticut. And you see Paris, Maine is where he got the Fuller title and put out some issues. And then New York, well, Oswego's not on my map, it's on yours. That's on the coast of Lake Ontario. But then Saratoga Springs are kind of like right together. You see that there. But also on this map, you see Lowhampton. That's where William Miller was from. I point that out at this time because the year James White started the publications, William Miller went to his rest. He was worn out from everything, the whole Millerite movement, and he was distressed by the fragmentation of much of the movement, and he felt sometimes unsure about some things, but he still believed Christ was coming soon, and he was faithful to his death. And Ellen White said that angels guard the precious dust of that saint. Well, James White was already wearing himself out with the publishing, traveling, and preaching, and he hoped to free himself from the writing, publishing part. And God picked out somebody for him. So I'm going to tell you a story about Annie Smith. When she was 16, she experienced a great disappointment and felt it as keenly as anybody. But when she became resigned that, we don't really know when Jesus is coming, she started thinking about her career. Now, that was a little unusual because most women in those days weren't thinking career like women do today, but she was thinking career because she was very, very talented. And so she settled into a routine alternating between teaching at nearby schools and studying at Charleston Female Seminary. She began writing poetry, and she would get published. Her work was good. And then she was invited to take charge of a school for wealthy kids, and the pay was going to be really good. And her younger brother Uriah was going to be able to come and be part of her staff, and she was really looking forward to a comfortable future. And then she got a letter in the mail from her mother. Her mother told her that there was a preacher coming to her area, that her mother wanted her to go hear. And so the preacher would be there on a Saturday, and Annie's thinking, well, I don't have to teach on Saturday. I guess I'll go and I can let Mom know I did what she asked and she'll be happy with me. So on Friday night, Annie had a dream. And in her dream, she arrived late to the meeting. And there was only one seat available near the door, so she took the seat. And then a tall gentleman got up and began to explain the 2300 day prophecy that ended in 1844 and why Jesus hadn't come. He also spoke about keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. And Annie was convicted in her dream, this is the truth. Well, the next day she had a busy schedule for some things she had planned earlier in the day. And then she forgot about the dream. And then because she was one of those people who always arrives on time, she left a little early to get there, but she got a little bit lost. And so she came in on the opening hymn right near the end, peeked in the door, saw one seat, and sat down, and then remembered the dream. She says, whoa, just like my dream. And so then she's watching with great attention, and then she sees a man get up, and this is the man she saw, and he began to explain the 20-day prophecy and why Jesus had come, and he explained the Sabbath. After the meeting, Annie was eager to go talk to him, and she was watching him closely when the meeting was over, and she saw him edging through the crowd, and she thought, I must talk to him. And then she realized he was working through a crowd coming toward her. And when he greeted her, warmly. He said, "I've never met you before, but I saw you last night in a dream." And Annie stared in astonishment. And she says, "Well, I dreamed of seeing you." And she goes, "I dreamed that what you shared was the truth, and now I know it is." And her whole heart pulsed with joy. And she decided to refuse that teaching position and stop writing for worldly publications. And not too long after that, she was called to help James White and others working at the Sabbath, or the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. She was an excellent proofreader, great help. Her hymns and poems began flowing from her nimble mind. James White recognized her remarkable talent and encouraged her to cultivate it. And soon her verses began to appear in the review, and she ended up becoming the assistant editor. Well, I want you to notice on the timeline, 1852 to 1855, they did all the publishing from Rochester, New York. It's right in the middle of the timeline. Sorry, it's a little sloppy there compared to the rest of the timeline, but they're in Rochester for 3 years. And you can look on your map and see where Rochester is. And one of the influences in this location was Hiram Edson. This is a part of the country Hiram Edson's from. He sold a farm and purchased a printing press. And they bought a sizable house in Rochester that had a few extra rooms, and they began bringing in young single adults to help with the publishing work. So Annie Smith would get her room, and, well, James started the youth instructor at that time, and he got his sister Anna to come and take over as editor of the youth instructor. And his brother Nathaniel came to help. They had become believers in the Three Angels' messages, and they were coming to help. And then Annie Smith was helping as assistant editor. During this time, they bought this house with no furniture, and they had no money, but they needed furniture. And the first thing they needed was chairs to go around a table so they could eat together. And James White came back with all discount chairs, broken ones that need to be fixed, not a single piece of furniture matched another one. And they ate beans nearly every day because that's all they could afford. They were poor, but happy doing God's work. And Uriah Smith came in and joined at that time, and he wrote about eating beans. He said, "Yeah, we eat beans 365 days a year." He goes, "I have no objection as long as it doesn't become a habit." Yeah. Sense of humor, huh? So during the time they were in Rochester, Ellen and James did a lot of traveling, and they often left Annie and all these young adults. By the way, Annie was older than Ellen, and Anna White, James' sister, was about the same age. They're all like young adults together. You think they became good friends? Yeah, I think they loved each other just like you would expect. Well, but James and Ellen would often go out and travel, and Joseph Bates and Hiram Edson and John Andrews came along. They're going out traveling, and Rochester, the home in Rochester is their home base. That's where they always come back and share what happened. But, James, he did a lot of the work while they were traveling. How do you write while you're traveling with a horse and buggy? Well, she explains it here. She says, "At noon, we would feed the horse beside the roadside, especially if there was nice grass to eat, and eat our lunch. And then my husband, laying his writing paper on the cover of our dinner box or on top of his hat, would write articles for the review and for the instructor." Not the most comfortable, I'm sure. Well, I mentioned that John Andrews, I was supposed to show that earlier. Okay, we'll go to John Andrews now. John Andrews at this time is probably mid-20s and looking much younger than this picture. He joined the team in Rochester, and he had writing ability, and so he could write articles, so he's a valuable contributor, but he's going out preaching, and he started a series of meetings in Rochester that were being well attended. Some young men were not sure what to think of the presentations. They said, "Is this guy deceiving us, or is this truth?" And they invited a friend of theirs to come listen and evaluate them. And of course, John Loughborough at that time was probably 25, so this is a much older picture. But they invited John Loughborough to come because he was considered smart, had practical wisdom and unusual common sense and discernment. And they knew if there was anything wrong with what this preacher was preaching, John Loughborough would figure it out. And Loughborough assured his friends that he'd have no problem detecting the flaws in the messages given by that preacher. But instead, he ended up finding the lectures to be incontrovertible. He soon became acquainted with the publishing team and amazed at their devotion. And he began to feel the call to preach this present truth. But he was very committed in a business in which he had invested all his assets. He says, I put everything I have into this, all this equipment and stuff. He couldn't see how he could get out of it. So he prayed that if God was calling him to preach, he'd help him sell off all his materials. He figured he could sell a little here and a little there and that it would be a long process. But almost immediately, someone knocked on his door and offered to purchase everything all in one shot. He was stunned, and he knew that was a call of God. Early on, he would go with John Andrews, traveling and preaching, and I'm sure he did the same with Joseph Bates and Hiram Edson. And it was at this time that the Whites traveled by train to Michigan and Wisconsin, in which that train wreck occurred. Now, while they were in Rochester, Ellen White became aware of her worsening health condition. And in Life Sketches 151, she really describes some very distinctive things that I want to share with you. She knew she had heart disease. She said it was difficult for me to breathe while lying down. She goes, I had upon my left eyelid a swelling and a little growth began to appear. And she goes, I knew it was cancer. She said it was painful and it affected my eyesight. A celebrated physician who gave counsel free visited Rochester, and she said, I decided to go to him to have him examine my eye. And while she was there with him, he said, you are much diseased and will die of apoplexy before that swelling will even break out. You're in a dangerous condition with disease of the heart. And she writes that it didn't startle her at all. She kind of knew that was true. And but there were two other women who had come to see the physician, and they were suffering from the same problems. And the physician said to Ellen that she was in a more dangerous condition than either of them, and it could not be more than 3 weeks before you will be afflicted with paralysis. He knew what he was talking about. In 3 weeks, she fainted and fell to the floor and remained unconscious for 36 hours. People around her feared that she wouldn't live. This is in the house there in Rochester. But in answer to prayer, she revived, but it was temporary. 1 week later, she says, I received a shock on my left side. I had a strange sensation of coldness and numbness in my head, severe pain in my temples. My tongue seemed heavy and numb. I could not speak plainly. My left arm and side were helpless. Obviously, a serious stroke. She says, the brethren and sisters came together to make my case a subject of a special prayer. She goes, but I grew more feeble by the hour. She said then she couldn't even pray out loud. She had to pray in her head. But while she was praying in her head, the promises of God were, she says, were arrayed before me as I had never viewed them before. And she felt like God was saying, can you believe the promises? Can you walk out by faith? Let the appearance be what it may. And her faith began to revive. She goes, I whispered to my husband, I believe I shall recover. And he answered, I wish I could believe it. I could not sleep, but continued my silent praying. And not too long before daybreak, I fell asleep. But when the sun came up, she says, I was perfectly free from pain. Oh, what a change. It seemed to me that an angel of God had touched me while I was sleeping. The pressure upon my heart was gone, and I was very happy. I was filled with gratitude. My afflicted eye was free from pain. In a few days, the swelling disappeared, and my eyesight was fully restored. The work was complete. This is the part I like the best. Again, I visited the physician. And as soon as he felt my pulse, he said, Madam, an entire change has taken place in your system. But the two women who visited me for counsel when you were last here are both dead. After I left, the doctor said to a friend of mine, Her case is a mystery. I do not understand it. But we do, don't we? It was also during their time in Rochester that some first evers took place in Bucksbridge, New York. In your map, you find Bucksbridge in northern New York. The first thing was a young girl. At the time of this story, she was a teenager still, maybe 18 or 19. She started the first school for children of Sabbath-keeping Adventists in Bucksbridge, New York. And her father, John Byington, felt the need to build a new church. It was the first church built for Sabbath-keeping Adventists there in Bucksbridge, New York, 1855. A sketch of what it looked like in the past, taken from a picture. And the church is no longer standing today, but there's a memorial stone there that calls it the first church built by Seventh-day Adventists, erected here under the direction of John Byington in 1855. And near the site was the first Seventh-day Adventist, they call it homeschool, taught in 1853 by his daughter Martha. So even though we didn't have the name Seventh-day Adventist yet, that is our heritage. So we see progress. And the title is The Refiner's Fire, Sacrifice and Progress. We see progress, but now we're going to look at some serious sacrifices. James White lost his younger brother who came to work on the team. Nathaniel was only 22 years old, died of tuberculosis. That must have broke James's heart. James was only 25 at the time. Nathaniel's 22. Annie Smith wrote a poem for Nathaniel, and the last verse reads like this: "Not long will earth's bosom his precious form hide, and death's gloomy portals from kindred divide. For swiftly approaching we see the bright day that brings the glad summons, arise, come away." So they really had a serious hope in the resurrection, didn't they? Well, then the foreman, the shop foreman, Luman Maston, died of cholera the next year. And the interesting thing about this is there was a cholera epidemic sweeping Rochester, and coffins were being stacked on every street corner in the city. Just try to grasp that. Every street corner in the city, coffins are being stacked every day. And Ellen wrote in Life Sketches 143 that we heard carriages rumbling through the streets all through the night as wagons were picking up these coffins and bringing them to Mount Hope Cemetery. The rumbling of the wheels never stopped. It was a pretty serious situation. Annie Smith wrote a poem for him as well. And then Anna White, 26-year-old, died of tuberculosis later that year. And Annie wrote a 10-stanza poem for her, and I'm going to share with you two of the stanzas. It says, "Sleep, dear sister, kind and tender, to friendship true, while with feeling hearts we render this tribute due. When the morn of glory breaking shall light the tomb, beautiful will be thy waking and fadeless bloom." She talks about friendship there with her. Anna White and Annie were the same age. And then Annie herself. She had tuberculosis right around the time Anna White died. By the way, I guess I have to say this, but James's brother and sister came to help. He lost them both. Can you imagine that? How much that loss would be to him, personally and for the work. And he must have wondered, God, why you let that happen? All you have to do is try to imagine being in his place, and you can understand this is not an easy time. And then he loses his right-hand editor, Annie Smith. And she got contracted tuberculosis right around the time Anna White died. And with no then known cure for the disease, she was marked for the grave. 2 days before her death, she wrote her last poem. It was just 2 verses. You want to hear it? Oh, shed not a tear o'er the spot where I sleep. For the living and not for the dead ye may weep. Why mourn for the weary who sweetly repose, free in the grave from life's burden of woes? I long now to rest in the lone, quiet tomb, for the footsteps of Jesus have lightened its gloom. I die in the hope of soon meeting again the friends that I love, with him ever to reign. Well, during that time, Ellen got word that her brother Robert Harmon was very ill and at their parents' house, and then she soon got word he passed away. So James and Ellen both lost siblings during their time in Rochester. And this picture of Annie Smith is a self-portrait. She drew it herself. And you think about some of the things that she offered. We actually sing a couple of her hymns from time to time. Do you know the hymn, I Saw One Weary? In that hymn, people that have analyzed the words think that the first verse is about James White, and the second verse about Joseph Bates, and the third verse is about John Andrews. And they even suspect she admired John Andrews a little more than just in the faith, but we don't know. They were the right age and all that. And then the hymn, How Far From Home. How Far From Home, she wrote. And there's another one that I wasn't familiar with. But when you think about what they went through and their losses, we have to remember Isaiah 63:9, where God says, in all their affliction, he was afflicted. And so when we see a verse like this, we realize it broke God's heart as much as it broke anyone else's, maybe even more, because the greater capacity to love, the greater capacity for pain. And then we have this verse, Revelation 14:13. Then I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors and their works follow them. We remember that the death of God's saints is precious in his eyes. Meanwhile, Joseph Bates and others are working Michigan and states westward, and the number of people reading the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald was exploding in that direction. In fact, the whites were being urged to move the press to Michigan, and they did, to Battle Creek in 1855. Now, a year later, both John Andrews and John Loughborough stopped traveling and preaching for the cause of present truth. They just quit. Why? There was no salary, no wages. They were totally dependent on the generosity of the believers, who often didn't realize what they had to deal with. And they got very discouraged. And so Andrews and Loughborough joined a community of Sabbath keepers who had all moved to Waukon, Iowa, to farm the fertile soil of Iowa. Ellen was later shown by the Lord that the people in that community were drifting away from the faith and they needed help. She said, God showed me they were in Satan's snare. And so she and James headed out in December 1856 in a large carriage, because of all the snow, not with wheels, but with runners. And so it was more like a sleigh than a carriage. And they had a driver that volunteered to go with them because it was going to be a long trip. And so they had a driver help. James would take his turn, then the driver. And the windy winter plains were, I'll use a New England acronym, were wicked cold, freezing cold. And then the weather started warming up. And the snow was melting and everything was getting slushy and muddy, and they had to take the runners off and put on wheels, find a shop where they could do that so they could get through the sloshing, melting snow and the mud. And when they reached the mighty Mississippi River, there was at least a foot of water flowing over the ice. No bridges over the Mississippi in those days. The word was that it wasn't safe to cross. In fact, they were told that a family had tried just a couple of days before and broke through the ice, and no one ever saw them again. No one in their right mind would even consider crossing until it was freezing cold again for at least a week, maybe two, to really get the ice good and hard. Well, Ellen's driver, he was a believer, and he knew Ellen had been driven by the Holy Spirit to make this trip. And he couldn't imagine that God would let this river stop them. But he thought, well, who am I? But they all got in the carriage and approached the river. They stopped at the riverbank, watching the water flowing, and you could look out, and there were spots that looked dark, and you wonder, is there even ice there? And, they could see that water's just flowing over ice, and they're not sure how thick it is and how strong it is now. The driver asked Ellen, do we go forward or do we not? And she said, go forward in the name of the Lord. And as they began to cross, people started noticing on the other side of the river and started gathering to watch these crazy people drown. When a train wreck happens, you gotta look, right? When they came up on the bank on the other side, there were around 200 people there to greet them with clapping and cheering and praising the Lord, and probably all wondering, who are these people? And that just makes me think of this verse. When you pass through the waters, I'll be with you, and through the rivers they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. Well, there's more to that story, because when they arrived in Waukon, they were not welcome. Nobody was happy to see them show up. All the Sabbath keepers there, Ellen White wrote, were sorry we had come. Most of the people had heard many lies and accusations against the whites and had believed a lot of nonsense and had prejudicial feelings toward them. And when they called a meeting that night, people came reluctantly, out of duty, didn't really want to be there. But over the next few days and nights, Ellen White wrote that there was much heartfelt confessions and true repentance, and everything was transformed. And not long after that, Andrews and Loughborough were back to being traveling preachers. It must have been hard. Well, a year and a half after that, James and Ellen were in Lovett Grove, Ohio, or Lovett's Grove in Ohio, and their meetings were closing on Saturday night. But there was to be a funeral the next day for a young toddler that wasn't even 2 years of age that had died. And James was asked if he could stay and speak at the funeral the next day. Toward the end of the service, Ellen was taken into vision. It interrupted the funeral for 2 hours. This was her major comprehensive great controversy vision. And you can see that on the timeline, 1858 GC vision. She was instructed by the angel that she needed to write it all out. She only shared a little bit there because these people had been waiting for 2 hours for her to come out of vision, so she just shared a little and everyone went home. But she was instructed to write it all out, and she was shown that the devil would try to stop her, but she was to trust in God and the protection of holy angels. Riding on the train back to Michigan, she spent most of the time sharing with James what she saw in that vision. And I'll bet you anything there was an invisible passenger listening to it all who was enraged. And so they started, while they were riding along the train, planning for the writing and publishing of the vision. And they got off the train in Jackson, Michigan to visit some dear friends in the faith. And while they were visiting, Ellen's tongue went numb and she couldn't talk. A strange cold sensation struck her heart, passed over her head and down her right side, and her left leg and arm became useless. Another stroke, a shock of paralysis. She was left like this for a few weeks in the home of her friends. But she felt that she had to try to write out the Great Controversy vision, even though it was pretty close to impossible. So she made a great effort, and it took her a day to write 1 page. And it was so exhausting that she had to rest for 3 days. And then she repeated it. And as she kept trying, she very gradually began to increase in strength until she finished her writing goal for what they wanted to publish at that time. And by then, she was completely recovered from the stroke. And that just makes me think of our scripture reading. The dragon was enraged with the woman and went to make war with the rest of her offspring, or the remnant of her seed, who keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus Christ. A couple months after this, God revealed to her that the stroke was a direct attack, an attempt by the devil to end her life, to keep her from ever writing out what she was shown in that vision. God also showed her that her health would be better in the future than at any time in the past. She's coming through, and God's not worried about her pride anymore. And he says, you're not going to be getting sick so much in the future. Well, besides the devil's attacks, what were other reasons for such poor health in the early to mid-1800s? You know, I mentioned the short average lifespan wasn't even 40. Why? Well, first there was these, epidemics, diphtheria, typhoid, cholera. They would wipe out lots of people in various areas. And drugs were dispensed without adequate knowledge or regulation. That day you could just go to any pharmacy and you could get opium. They probably had more people addicted to drugs than we did in our drug culture, but they just didn't know it. They were just using it to mask pain, and then they're getting hooked and dying, and they didn't even know what was causing death. They didn't realize how bad the opium was. They thought it was other things. It was just a time of tremendous ignorance in the medical world. And that, smoking was prescribed for lung problems. Is that bizarre? Bloodletting was still practiced. Some of you probably know that that's what George Washington died from. Too much blood released by a doctor. And spoiled meat. In that day, because they didn't have refrigeration, the spices and condiments that were put on meat were largely to preserve it, as well as maybe give it more flavor. The problem is the spicing and all that was so heavy that when the meat started going bad, people couldn't even tell. And so people were getting food poisoning left and right. And you can understand without refrigeration, those kind of things would be a big challenge, right? All right, so who had some good ideas in health in those days? Who were the health reformers of that time? There was a guy named Dr. Jackson. He had a place called Our Home on the Hillside in Danville, New York, and you can see Danville, New York on your map. That home on the hillside is still there. I discovered it by accident one time when I went through Danville on a freeway, and I thought this building looked like something I'd seen before on the side of a hill. It kind of stood out when I drove through on the interstate, and I looked it up, and I said, sure enough, I don't know what it is now, but it was it. It's still there. He used hydrotherapy or water cure, but he didn't believe religion helped people get better. He thought religion detracted from getting better. So he liked guys to play cards, not have devotions when they were there. But water cure did work. And then there was Dr. Trawl, who opened a school of health in New Jersey. You could go through that school of health in 3 months and learn water cure and a few other things, and then the students could go out and practice medicine. Some of them even claimed they were doctors. But yet no one was teaching the importance of basic personal hygiene, or even brushing teeth, or the danger of greasy, spicy meat, and the need for open windows to let fresh air in the house at night. There was a belief at that time that night air could kill you and make you sick. And so, I'm really tempted to tell you a story on that, but we'll get to that another time. And then there was Sylvester Graham at Oberlin College. He was promoting a vegetarian diet, way ahead of his time. And then there was one Sabbath keeper, Joseph Bates, was the only Adventist that was a health reformer. And the interesting thing about this whole period of time is everyone else, Edson, Andrews, James White, Ellen White, Loughborough, they're getting sick all the time. Joseph Bates never got sick. And he was the old guy. He was 30 years older than all the rest of them. he was more hardy, and, I don't know all the reasons why he was so healthy, but, as a ship captain, he had become convicted that the usual reward for hard work was rum, and then sailors would get drunk. He said, this doesn't make sense for a Christian. And so his ships were teetotaling ships, no alcohol. And so obviously for a while, he probably had a hard time getting sailors. But eventually, people who wanted that would be on his ship and even other ships. Joseph Bates was the president of a temperance society in a region. And he was really into just avoiding things that obviously were harmful, like smoking and stuff like that, alcohol. And so Ellen White had some early health visions, and the early ones are very simple. 1848, she was shown the injurious effect of tobacco, tea, and coffee. It's not good for you, that's all. And then 3 years later, it gets a little stronger. She was shown that tobacco is a filthy weed that could cause the loss of salvation. Like, huh? Yes, she said, God showed me that when you continue to smoke, you're putting that ahead of Jesus. It's an idol in your life. And when you put things ahead of Jesus, that can jeopardize your salvation. So that was like, oh, you mean we don't just need to know it's bad, we actually have to quit? Pretty much. And then in 1854, she was shown the importance of personal cleanliness and a simple diet with fruits and vegetables, and that pork wasn't good. I mean, what do you think about how this is a 6-year period? God's given it to him gradually. He's given them the information a little bit at a time to give them a chance to kind of, well, I'll use the word digest it, to soak it in and start making changes. So we have to be compassionate when people find out stuff. We don't give it to them all at once. It's pretty heavy sometimes. And then in 1863, she had her comprehensive health vision, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But this makes me think of 3 John 2. Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. So now, I want to come back to James White, and because the publishing work was a business, it had to have ownership. James White owned it because somebody had to. But he was being accused of trying to get rich off the publishing. It's ridiculous because the truth was he was poor and sacrificing, and everybody that was part of it was poor and sacrificing. The Whites were also accused of being self-promoters because when Ellen had visions, they would put them in the paper. People saying, yeah, the Whites are all full of themselves. But the paper was the glue that held all the believers together, and so James actually stopped putting Ellen's visions in the paper. He didn't put any in for 4 years because of the criticism. But James wanted some type of organization or corporation to own the press. And so they had a meeting in Battle Creek in 1860. The problem with if you're going to start a corporation to own the press, it has to have a name, right? And they chose the name Seventh-day Adventist. It's the Seventh-day Adventist Publishing Association. And it wasn't so much a name for a church as a name for a business. But in that group meeting, the people must have realized the potential this would give for organization. And soon after, the next year, the churches of Michigan sent delegates and had a general meeting, and they organized a conference of churches for Michigan. So the Michigan conference was organized before there was a general conference. And they chose leaders of their conference. And they chose to call it the Michigan Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, which is still what it's called today. And then the New England states said, well, we can do that too. So the Maine Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, the New Hampshire Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, the New York Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, they did the same. Now, right around that time, the Civil War had started, and Ellen White was speaking in a church in Michigan, and while she was there, she went into vision. And God showed her things about the Civil War. In fact, she was shown the first Battle of Bull Run, if you're a Southerner, or Manassas if you're a Northerner. And she was shown that an angel had a great effect on what happened in that battle. I'd like to go into detail on that, but for time I won't. And so But the reason why I wanted to bring this up here, because this is actually connected to the organization process. Because the Civil War ended up getting many to see that they needed an organization on a national level, not just on a state level. Well, why? Why would they need a national organization? Because of Civil War draft problems. Only a government-recognized church could negotiate with the federal government. And so for ministers not to be drafted, they had to have a license. Now, this license wasn't state control. It was the state needed to see that an official church was licensing their own ministers. Because they didn't want someone coming up saying, I'm a minister, you can't draft me. They'd say, well, you need to produce a license to show which denomination you work for. So licensing ministers was important so they wouldn't be drafted, and also to negotiate non-combatant status for Sabbath-keeping Adventists that got drafted. So then there were other reasons for organizing a general conference. They needed to develop a system for financial remuneration to pay pastors. And, we remember what happened with Loughborough and Andrews. They needed a better system. And then the last one probably doesn't need a national conference, but for churches to be owned by the conference and not by individuals. So a lot of you know that conferences hold the title or the deed to churches, and some people think that that's just trying to get control. So if I give you a little history, you'll understand why that happened. Because at this time, who owned churches they met in, if they had churches at all? Individuals did. Usually the wealthiest member of a church was the one who owned the building or had done something to get it built. And if the church had a falling out, that wealthy member could just say, you can't use my church anymore. And that happened twice at that time. Congregations were kicked out of buildings because the guy who owned it didn't like something they did or said. And so you can understand that there has to be an ownership of a church through a larger system than just somebody in the congregation or something like that. So anyway, when they met in Battle Creek, delegates from 6 state conferences, they had 6 state conferences at that time, they met and they voted for James White to be the General Conference president, and he refused. He thinking, of all the things I'm already being accused of, and I'm the one who pushed for organization, they're going to think I pushed for organization so I could become a king. They think this is what my goal was. So they chose John Byington, the guy who built the first Adventist church up in Bucksbridge, New York. Interesting thing about John Byington is he had never been a Millerite. Because, that Bible verse says, no man knows the day or the hour. He kept thinking of that verse, and he didn't join the Millerite movement. But he believed Christ was coming soon, and he was sympathetic to a lot of things Millerites were into, but he said, they're date setting. And so he never became a Millerite. And so when he heard the explanations for the 2000 days, he says, now this is what I'm waiting for. This appeals to my brain. And so he became a Seventh-day Adventist, and he was the first General Conference president of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. At that time, the Seventh-day Adventist Church only existed in the Northeast states and the North Midwest states. There was nothing below the Ohio River. And that same year, Ellen White had her comprehensive health vision. And because a lot of people in this church are in the medical work, I'm not even going to comment on anything other than the bullet points. Because so much could be said about everyone. The spiritual basis for health reform came up. There's a lot of Adventists that think the only reason to health reform is to be healthy physically. But it's more than that. It has to do with the clarity of your brain and the ability of the Holy Spirit to impress your mind, too. So anyway, I said I wouldn't be making comments. All right, and then moderation is the primary meaning for temperance. Balance and moderation. Emphasize a meatless diet, especially no pork. And the value of hydrotherapy or water cure over drug treatments. And natural remedies, especially fresh air. And that leaves me with this verse, that God wants us to prosper and be in good health. And then as we kind of go back to that title slide, the refiner's fire part 2. Do you see why I'm using the term refiner's fire? Some of these stories, that's it for sure, because of the sacrifice, the loss. But do you see the progress too? Because when they organized the general conference, they had gone from 50 people to 300 to 3,000 or 3,500. God is definitely working, and the work goes marching on. The truth goes marching on. Our closing hymn is 522, My Hope is Built.